will introduce Bob, and then I will read a little something I wrote about him a long time ago. I want to give you a little surprise, Bob. So Robert Allison is a professor of history at Suffolk University. His books include The Crescent Obscured, The United States and the Muslim World, a biography of American naval hero Stephen Decatur, and which I recommended to my son, and he's reading right now, I think, and short books on the history of Boston, the American Revolution, and an edition of the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano or Gustavo Sfasa, the African. And I think this is one of the books that have been assigned by our faculty members in one of their classes on race, from what I understand. And two of his classes, before 1776, Life in Colonial America and The Age of Benjamin Franklin, are available from the grade courses. As chair of Revolution 250, a consortium of organizations planning revolutionary commemorations in Massachusetts, he hosts its weekly podcast featuring conversations on the Revolution with historians and interpreters. He is president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, a scholarly organization focused on early American history, and a life trustee of the USS Constitution Museum. So one could not find a more ideal person, scholar, historian, to address this topic of 1619. But I want to tell you that in the late 90s, I'm going to read something which eventually my experience when I first got to know Bob, and eventually which led me to a incredible intellectual adventure. He opened new vistas of scholarship for me. So when I published one of my books in 2004 called Freedom and Orthodoxy, which, so it's almost 20 years ago that this book was published. This is what I said in my preface. Provincial as I am, I've had the good fortune of knowing Jack Downs of the legendary history professor at UNE who passed away many years ago, great friend, once again by passing on to me a Book of the Month monograph on the history of Islam and the United States during the Revolutionary era, expanded my horizons beyond my expectations. I had been casually interested in the early history of Islam in America, but it was Robert J. Allison's The Crescent Obscured, the United States and the Muslim World, 1776, 1815, first published in 1995, that enlarged my vistas and led me into the study of Barbary captivity narratives and their historical context. As I stated in my review of the book in the Journal of American Studies of Turkey, I think it was in 1998, portions of which are republished here, Professor Allison's book is, in my estimation, a groundbreaking study of US-Muslim relations in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, because it foregrounds much of what is happening today in a richer historical context. I am profoundly grateful to Professor Allison for his scrupulously researched work and for being such a constant source of information and support. This has been true since then, and I am still very grateful to you, Bob. Thank you for coming.
I would be happy to let Anouar continue talking about this. And I vividly remember the phone message I received from someone I didn't know who had just read my book. And if you have written a book, you probably know that you very rarely get anyone calling you to talk about it. And I remember Anouar said he had read it, he would assign it, he would give it as gifts. So you can see why we became very good friends. And it's always a pleasure to come here, both to see Anouar, but also to see this beautiful campus and meet more of the University of New England family. And I'm always impressed with this place, and particularly on a beautiful evening like this, here we all are inside listening to a lecture on a dreary historical topic. It's really, I think this really exemplifies the idea of a university where people come together to talk about ideas, so I admire you for that. And since Anouar did mention Revolution 250, which has a weekly podcast, I should tell you our guest on Tuesday is Anouar Majid. So, in early 2019, the New York Times had a staff meeting to kick around ideas for their Sunday magazine. And staff writer Nicole Hannah-Jones noted that the year 2019 would be the 400th anniversary of the arrival of 20 African people in the Jamestown colony. This is the first documented arrival of African people in British North America. The editors immediately saw the importance and the potential of this story, not only as a Sunday magazine story, but as a way of reframing American history. Unlike the previous and subsequent week's issues of the Sunday magazine, which had to cover stories on the Rohingya genocide and on Venus Williams, with additional stories within on campaign ads, on Nicolas Cage, on Neil Young, and on Mayor Bill de Blasio, this one would focus entirely on 1619 and the arrival of these African people and the long impact of slavery on American history. And in addition, unlike other magazine issues, this one would have a curriculum package, which the New York Times would send to every school in the country, as well as a children's book, a Hulu miniseries, and ultimately an expanded volume of nearly 500 pages with the tagline, "A New Origin Story." So this was no ordinary Sunday supplement. The story of slavery deserves this kind of treatment, and over the past half-century, there's been no area of American history receiving as much scholarly attention, with extraordinary research being done into the institution's nature, its origins, its impact for the Americans and for the Africans involved in it, and on America and on Africa. Just to mention a few of these pieces, Eric Williams, probably the West Indies' leading public intellectual in the 20th century, wrote a monumental study, Slavery and Capitalism, which gave an economic history of the Caribbean, which he published in 1944. In 1967, David Bryan Davis published the first volume of his trilogy on the problem of slavery in Western culture. Richard Dunn's book, Sugar and Slaves, focuses on the development of slavery in the 17th century West Indies. Ira Berlin showed how the institutions of slavery differed in different places in the Americas and changed over time. Michael Gomez's book, Exchanging Our Country Marks, shows how the African people forcibly brought to America came not from Africa, but from specific places and particular ethnicities. They were Wolof and Yoruba, Igbo, Xhosa, and Golan, and they brought with them traditions, skills, ideologies, religious beliefs, which have shaped the subsequent history of the country. And historians of Africa, such as John Thornton and Joseph Inukuri, have explored the impact of the slave trade on African societies. In addition, David Eltis, Steve Barrett, David Richardson, and Herbert Klein, each of whom has written studies well worth reading, well-written, well-researched books and articles on the transatlantic and Indian Ocean slave trades, have created a massive CD-ROM project, the African Slave Trade, which documents every known slaving voyage between Africa and the New World from 1450 into the end of the 19th century. None of this seems to have been consulted by the authors of the 1619 Project. Lerone Bennett's 1961 book, Before the Mayflower, which Nicole Hannah-Jones encountered as a high school student in the 1990s, does loom large. In the 1990s, she had taken a course at her Iowa high school on African-American history, taught by the school's only African-American male teacher, who gave her a copy of this well-worn paperback book, which begins with the year 1619. I should note I also read it as a high school student 20 years before she did, which doesn't give me any necessarily primacy in this, but just shows this is a book that's been around. And Bennett's book does show the importance of African and African-American people to the nation's life and history. So what happened in 1619? Two ships, the White Lotus and the Treasurer, landed some 32 Africans in the fledgling English settlement at Jamestown. They had taken these people from the São João Batista, a Portuguese slaver that these English privateers had captured. And it's not clear what status these individuals, these 32 individuals, had when they landed, but most people in Jamestown were indentured servants. And Jamestown itself was a death trap. Between 1617 and 1640, some 20,000 people emigrated into the Virginia colony. And by 1640, the population of Virginia was 8,000. 20,000 people to produce a population of 8,000. And by 1640, 300 of the people of Jamestown were of African descent. 6,000 of the people in Jamestown were indentured servants, or were servants of one kind or another. One of the 17th century Chesapeake's leading historians, Lorena Walsh, argues that the Virginians were not turning to Africa to solve their persistent labor problem, but were continuing to rely on European indentured servants, servants from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Edmund Morgan's magisterial American Slavery, American Freedom, published in 1975, argues that the real turn to Africa came after the 1670s, when white indentured servants began surviving longer, that is, outliving their indenture, and thus demanding the land to which their contracts entitled them. And at the same time, British traders began taking a larger role in the transatlantic African slave trade, which had been in operation now for 2 centuries. The 1619 Project ignores the work of Walsh and Morgan and the wealth of other available historical work, focused so closely on the development of the United States and trying to prove that slavery is intrinsic to it, ignores the development of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, and for that matter, the story of slavery in the long span of human history. For example, why was the São João Batista sailing, and where was it bound with these enslaved Africans? The first people of African descent were brought to the New World not in 1619, but in 1505, and they came not from Africa, but from Portugal. These 17 individuals were Ladinos, that is, descendants of people of African descent who had been brought into the Portuguese orbit in the mid-1400s, first to grow sugar on São Tomé and in the Cape Verde Islands, and then to work in mainland Portugal itself. Portugal's Atlantic islands began producing sugar, which had been cultivated by enslaved labor since the time sugar was first cultivated commercially in the Indus River Valley and in the Euphrates River Valley, and then sugar cultivation had been imported into the Mediterranean during the Crusades. And by 1519, that is about a dozen or so years after the arrival of these Ladinos, the Spanish were producing sugar and tobacco, which is a New World crop, with enslaved labor, both African and indigenous, on Hispaniola. At this same time, or in the early 1600s, or in the second decade of the 1600s, John Rolfe in Jamestown began experimenting with tobacco brought by an English adventurer from the Orinoco River Valley. Virginia's native tobacco was too harsh for the European market, as Europeans preferred milder tropical strains of tobacco. And by the 1620s, this good Orinoco tobacco was being successfully cultivated in Virginia, which now had a cash crop. But the real tobacco and sugar plantations were not in Jamestown, but in South America and the West Indies. And that is where the São João Batista was taking these 32 Africans when the White Lotus and the treasurer attacked it. So the African slave trade was well underway before these 32 individuals reached Jamestown, and Brazil, Suriname, and the islands of the Caribbean were the real market for enslaved Africans. Of the 10 to 20 million people brought forcibly from Africa to the New World, the 1619 Project uses the figure of 12.5 million with some more specificity than may be warranted. Some 47% of these folks went to South America, 42% to the West Indies, 7% came to British North America, which was a secondary or tertiary market. So we do need to ask, and historians have asked, what is the impact of slavery on those societies and those cultures? What impact has it had in Brazil, in Cuba, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic? Historians have also pondered, and still have not yet devised, how the English, who had no experience with the institution of slavery as a hereditary condition, came to adopt it in North America. To leave Virginia briefly, the ship Desire in 1638 brought the first enslaved Africans to Boston. And 4 years later, Massachusetts became the first mainland colony in British North America to codify the institution of slavery in its legal code. English law didn't recognize chattel slavery as an inheritable status, so it had to be created by law. Now, New England merchants traded in enslaved people as in other goods. They didn't have the capacity in New England to grow sugar or tobacco, which were becoming the Atlantic world's leading commodities. So New Englanders had to find other ways to prosper. Their real focus became trade. With large families producing more offspring, New Englanders did not need to rely on imported labor or enslaved labor, although when they could, they would take opportunities to enslave or indenture native people, as well as Irish, Scots, and English people. The servitude in British North America was not racial, though over the 17th century, at least in the Chesapeake, it became so. And that is history, and that's the history that the 1619 Project ignores. Massachusetts, as I said, created the status of hereditary slavery through law in 1642. In Virginia, the status was a bit more ambiguous, and it seems to have been derived from a legal case. One John Caesar claimed that he was bound for only 7 years to his owner, Anthony Johnson. Johnson had earned a 250-acre headright on Virginia's eastern shore for bringing more servants into the labor-starved colony. Claiming that his 7 years owed to Johnson were up, Caesar fled, took refuge with Robert Parker. Johnson went to court, charging that Caesar was still bound to him and that Parker had unrightly deprived him of his chattel. The court agreed with Anthony Johnson. Caesar still belonged to him. Parker had to pay damages for keeping Johnson's property. Johnson, in 1654, legally established the right of one person in Virginia to own the lifetime labor of another. And Anthony Johnson had come a long way since 1619, when he and 19 other Africans had stepped ashore off the White Lotus. Slavery is above all a labor system. Barbara Fields, the historian, has argued that the ideology of racism emerged out of the slave system that was operating in America, and with the ideology of this labor system came the concept of race itself. This is in contrast to Winthrop Jordan, who in 1968 argued otherwise in his book White Over Black, suggesting that it was the ideology of blackness or perceptions of blackness which had made it possible or made it likely for English folks to enslave African people. It's an argument which came first, racism or slavery, and it's an argument we can continue to have. But by seeing racial categories as fixed and unchanged and unchangeable, the 1619 Project suggests there is really no point in studying history at all. If nothing changes, what is, was, always shall be. But to be fair, the 1619 Project is not meant to be history, but only means to use history. Who controls the past, the party said in 1984, controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. By creating a new origin story, by making a new myth with which to shape our world, the New York Times aims to control the future. It presents the 1619 Project as a new origin story, or as one of the critics has called it, a just so story that posits that things are bad now because of this terrible thing that happened then. Slavery is at the root of the evils that the Times addresses, evils that, of course, the Times addresses in other ways. The wealth gap, disparities in health care, the imprisonment of children, the distribution of political power, all are addressed in the 1619 Project as the Times seeks to supplant the other just so story with which we have organized ourselves, the origin of 1776. 1776, though, it does offer different options for the American polity. Not all of them guarantee perfection or progress, but the revolutionary era's arc does bend toward justice. Out of the revolution came religious freedom. And curiously, the 1619 Project doesn't address religion at all, a very large omission in a study of the African American experience. And also came the notion of a free press, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and limits to the size and scope of the state. Now, some of these are things which continue to enjoy the support of the New York Times. But our interest tonight is not myth, but history. In response to the 1619 Project, the World Socialist website, and I'm not sure how many of you are regular readers of the World Socialist website, interviewed some of the nation's leading historians, among them Victoria Bynum, who is actually one of the leading scholars of the poor whites of the South. The Matthew McConaughey movie, The Free State of Jones, is based on one of Victoria Bynum's books. Stephen Oates, who's written biographies of John Brown, Nat Turner, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King. Claiborne Carson, who's an historian of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and also the author of an autobiography of Martin Luther King. Adolph Reed, Jr., who's the author of studies on the political thought of W.E.B. Du Bois, and also a regular commentator on politics in The Nation, Harper's, and The New Republic. Sean Wilentz, who's possibly the country's leading social historian, whose most recent book is No Property in Man, a look at slavery and anti-slavery at the time of the founding, which he delivered first as the Nathan Huggins Lectures at Harvard in 2018, and Gordon Wood, who is the Dean of American Revolutionary Historians. Their criticisms appeared in their interviews, as well as in a letter they sent to the New York Times. They had asked historian Barbara Fields, the author of Race and Racecraft, as well as other works on race and slavery, to be interviewed, but she demurred, saying that the first few bars of the 1619 Project had disinclined her to waste her time on the rest of the operetta. Ask, she said, their writers to take the time to read Edmund Morgan, or Eugene Genovese, or Eric Williams, or any of the explosion of rich literature about slavery in the United States and the hemisphere published over the last century. What an idea. Now, the historical criticism focused mainly on some contentions in Hannah Jones's introductory essay, which frames the project. First, fearing that in the wake of the 1772 Somerset decision and Lord Dunmore's April 1775 proclamation of emancipation, that the British Empire was embarked on a campaign to liberate their slaves, the Americans launched the Revolution. That Lincoln supported the colonization of freed black people, and that throughout American history, black people had fought alone with no allies against slavery and to establish democracy. Now, the scholars dismantled these claims as well as others, enough so that the New York Times, while publicly defending its magazine's interpretations, quietly corrected them, adding in the online edition qualifiers that some Americans might have been motivated, that black people had few allies, and tamping down the overemphasis on Somerset and on Lord Dunmore. The American Historical Association also weighed in. The editor of the American Historical Review said he wished that their journal, rather than the socialist website, had printed the interviews with these distinguished historians, which are well worth reading. But still, it came down on the side of the larger truth of the 1619 Project. Hannah Jones, though, brooks no criticism. Many historians, she wrote, have been seduced by the desire to manage the story of our founding, protecting our identity as an exceptional, fundamentally just nation, the freest in the world. And what seemed to provoke so much ire, she said, was that we had breached the wall between academic history and popular understanding. And we had done so in the New York Times, the paper of record, in a major multimedia project led by a black woman. One asks if the historians challenging the new myth are motivated by racism, sexism, filiopietistic nationalism. And would they have objected if Barbara Fields, say, or Taya Miles, who contributed an essay to the 1619 Project, or Annette Gordon Reed, or Nell Painter had launched a redefinition of American history? Likely not. Or would they have found fault? Would historians have found fault if, say, Oprah Winfrey had engaged with historians to rethink the way we engage with the story? Our fundamental goal as historians, well, our two fundamental goals as historians are first, to figure out what happened, and then B, to engage the public with this story. Few historians don't want their work to be widely shared. Now, in response to two particular criticisms, that the magazine had said nothing at all about Native Americans and that it completely left out Frederick Douglass, the book version includes many quotes from Douglass, including, and used to great effect, his monumental 5th of July address, in which he asks, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" And it also has a long essay by Taya Miles on the Cherokee and their dispossession, a subject about which she has written a book and numerous articles. And Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who wrote an essay on slavery and sugar for the magazine version, which focused completely on Louisiana, has a revised, expanded version of his essay, which also continues to focus on Louisiana, not discussing sugar and slavery in the West Indies or in South America. The book version also includes more historians. Martha Jones wrote an essay on the colored conventions of the 19th century. Leslie Alexander, an historian, along with Michelle Alexander, wrote about the impact of the Haitian Revolution. Anthea Butler wrote about the Black Church. In an essay which discusses at great length the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, but leaves out Howard Thurman, the theologian, and for that matter, Adam Clayton Powell, Elijah Muhammad, and Louis Farrakhan. Jesse Jackson only appears in the timeline, and Malcolm X only comes in to offer an unsavory challenge to Martin Luther King. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had been hardly mentioned in the magazine version, which actually had very little to say about the civil rights movement at all. In fact, the book says that the largest protest movement for social justice in our country's history happened in the summer of 2020. Journalists do live in the present and are searching for a history that is immediately usable to their task at hand. The book also includes poetry, short stories, and fictional vignettes, offering, in some cases, new views on the history that is being conveyed. And among the 36 authors are the Poets Laureate of Mississippi and of Virginia, as well as 2 Poets Laureate of the United States. And among them, the authors have earned 8 Pulitzer Prizes, 6 National Book Awards, 4 Whiting Prizes, 3 Lannan Literary Awards, 2 Pushcart Prizes, 2 prizes from Penn, the Frost Medal for Lifetime Contribution to Poetry, the Wallace Stevens Award for Lifetime Achievement from the American Academy of Poets, the John Newbery Silver Medal, the National Humanities Medal, the National Medal for the Arts, the Lamont Poetry Prize, 14 Guggenheim Fellowships, 4 MacArthur Fellowships, and 1 Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. If there is a literary or intellectual firmament, these certainly are stars fixed in it. But the most powerful piece might be the epigraph from Langston Hughes. I am the American heartbreak, the rock on which freedom stumped its toe, the great mistake Jamestown made long ago. Now, the most curious essays in both the magazine and the book are by sociologist Matthew Desmond. In the magazine, Desmond links capitalism and slavery, not with reference to Eric Williams' book, which in fact is called Capitalism and Slavery, but instead with reference to the new history of capitalism, whose proponents, economic historians, contend that capitalism, an economic system which they do not seem to like, is rooted in the institution of slavery. It's an argument that certainly would have surprised George Fitzhugh, the 1850s most prominent pro-slavery writer, who argued that capitalism and slavery were incompatible. Chattel slavery, he argued, was superior to the free labor regime of the North. And the argument also would have astounded Karl Marx, who saw the Civil War as an inevitable conflict between an emerging bourgeois capitalist order driven by the industrial North against a feudal agrarian order relying on slave labor. For Desmond and the New History of Capitalism school, the fact that slave owners had an interest in making money and that some engaged in double-entry bookkeeping is evidence that the modern capitalist order originated not in the banks or factories or counting houses, but on the plantation. Desmond cites a statistic that every year after 1801, the average daily amount of cotton picked per worker increased by 2.3%, so that by 1861, the average enslaved field worker was picking 400% more cotton than his or her 1801 counterpart. Behind this increase, he argues, was the capitalist plantation regime extracting as much labor from its workers through increasingly brutal whippings and the mercilessness of double-entry bookkeeping. Desmond's statistics and interpretation actually come from a book by Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, which uses that 2.3% figure to make the argument of capitalist brutality. Now, Baptist found the statistic in a 2008 paper by two economists, Alan Olmsted and Paul Rode, who had combed the records of 150 plantations, and using that and other statistical evidence, argued that the increase in production, which made cotton the leading American export, and the United States the world's leading cotton producer, surpassing India, came not from more whippings, but from agricultural and biological innovation. Hybrid seed strains produced better cotton, which was easier to pick and impervious to disease. And how much might the enslaved have contributed to this hybridization? Desmond might have read Taya Miles' brief essay on the pecan in the magazine to get another glimpse into plantation agriculture. At Louisiana's Oak Alley Plantation, an enslaved man known to us only as Antoine had been given the task of grafting and cultivating pecan cuttings onto other trees. A pecan tree doesn't produce any nuts in its first years, and those produced vary widely in size and shape. Antoine was able to produce well-shaped, standard-sized, easily shellable nuts, and these became a cash crop. He may not have lived to see his pecans brought to market under the varietal name Centennial in recognition of the commendation they received at the 1876 Philadelphia Exposition. And Antoine was not the only black innovator working under this brutal regime. We know that the first Africans brought to South Carolina were Wolof people who had been long harvesting rice along the Senegal River, and they turned the South Carolina Low Country into a major rice-producing area, the only one in the British Empire. The Wolof, who went to Louisiana early in the 1700s, also brought with them okra, and with okra and with rice and with shrimp, they prepared their traditional dish of Wolof rice, which becomes known to us as jambalaya. And the fishermen who had been plying their long, narrow boats along the Senegal now built and plied these same boats, which we call pirogues, along the bayous of the lower Mississippi. Seeing only victims, Desmond misses much of this story. Now, economic historians have pointed out his many errors, and one's actually written a full-length book about them. But Desmond has not retracted, but has expanded. In the book version, he ventures from economics into history and writes of the framing of the Constitution in 1787 as a struggle between free states and slave states, and tells us that at several points, the issue of slavery ground the Constitutional Convention to a halt, and both Northern and Southern representatives threatened to dissolve the Union altogether. I can't find where this happened. Only one state at the 1787 convention, Massachusetts, had abolished slavery. The convention did, on several occasions, threaten to fall apart, but it wasn't over the issue of slavery. It was over many other issues, and on the 30th of June, the issue was representation. The larger states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, wanted population alone to count for representation in the federal government. The smaller states, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, wanted each state to have an equal vote. The small states wanted to call for reinforcements. They wanted George Washington, the presiding officer, to write to the governor of New Hampshire to hasten their delegates to Philadelphia. And in the midst of this, James Madison, a proponent of population as the basis for representation, pointed out that ultimately the real division would not be between large states and small, but between those where slavery existed and those where it did not. Desmond uses this quote not to show that Madison was perceptive about future developments, but to say that slavery was the dividing issue of 1787. In this great division of June the 30th between North and South, only New York and New Jersey wanted Washington to call for New Hampshire's delegates. The rest were content to leave New Hampshire out. And the convention's most vociferous attacks on slavery came not from the free states, but from Maryland and Virginia. George Mason, who owned more people than anyone else in the convention, wanted to end the transatlantic slave trade immediately. And he said that slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration of whites who really enrich and strengthen a country, Mason said. And they produce the most pernicious effects on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. Mason lamented that some of our Eastern brethren, and by that he meant the New Englanders, had from a lust of gain embarked in this nefarious traffic. As to the states being in possession of the right to import, this was the case with many other rights, now to be properly given up. He held it essential in every point of view that the general government should have the power to prevent the increase of slavery. Now, it is hard for me to see in this how Mason is defending slavery, and also hard to see why the Virginians, who according to the 1619 Project had in 1775 rebelled in order to protect the institution of slavery, now are calling it a national calamity, a national sin. And it's also harder to square with the argument Desmond crafts from his cursory look at the Constitution that it gave each state a practical veto on national policy, a point which Daniel Webster and Andrew Jackson challenged in the 1830s. Desmond makes the Constitution as unambiguously pro-slavery as John C. Calhoun and Roger Taney would. And while the Constitution did allow slavery to continue, as Frederick Douglass pointed out in the 1850s, it also made it constitutionally suspect. But Desmond is not really interested in what changed over the 17th and 18th century, or in the question or the point that Eugene Genovese made, that one generation, the generation of Jefferson and Madison and Mason, could condemn slavery while enjoying the life it made possible, but the next generation, that of the 1820s and 1830s, had to choose sides. And almost invariably, those who did choose sides in the 1830s and 1840s chose slavery over a commitment to human rights, and began to argue that not only that slavery was not a necessary evil, but a positive good. Instead, Desmond and the journalists who contributed to the 1619 Project want to show how Jamestown's original sin leads to every contemporary ill. No national health care, disparities in wealth, health, and incarceration rates. Their real issue is not to understand the Constitution, but to make it morally suspect so that it can be replaced with something more palatable to sociologists and columnists. The system Desmond yearns for is really a bit startling. To this day, he writes, the 15 states where slavery remained legal in 1861 still hold the power to block a constitutional amendment supported by the other 35. Well, this, of course, is true. 3/4 of the states need to agree on a constitutional amendment, which means that any 15 can block any 35. The Constitution doesn't say which 15 and doesn't make the criteria that they did or did not allow slavery in 1861. Any 15 can do it. Maine and Massachusetts and California and New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Illinois, Michigan, Colorado, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington, for example, can block anything that those other pernicious states might conceive. But this isn't the Constitution's great failing, according to Professor Desmond. It's not that it allowed the slave trade to continue, nor that it permitted each state to veto things the others wanted to do, or that 15 states can scuttle his desires, but that it protects property and did not allow the federal government to tax it. Instead, the federal government had to rely on tariffs, taxes on imports, to sustain itself. Imagine, he says, if the United States had followed a similar path, a path similar to Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, and established the Internal Revenue Service, not in a moment of crisis, it was first formed during the Civil War, but at the nation's founding. In this alternative universe, Professor Desmond writes, the IRS could have been given adequate financial backing and administrative support, enabling it to function efficiently and fairly. Taxes would not have been hidden in American consumerism. Rather, they could have been transparently collected as a portion of each person's income and seen as a patriotic duty, an investment in the nation. But, of course, he concludes, this is not our history. No, it certainly is not. And I should just point out that the income tax amendment, which seems to be a piece of the Constitution he would strongly favor, seven of the first 10 states to ratify it were Alabama, Kentucky, South Carolina, Mississippi, Maryland, Georgia, and Texas, and the other states where slavery existed in 1787 and 1861 and 1913 also came to support the income tax. That's, I suppose, a historical nitpicking, but one does wonder if it is a national failing that the Internal Revenue Service lacks adequate financial backing and administrative support. And I will leave it to you. Perhaps in the question period we can discuss whether that alternative universe is one in which we would happily live. Now, aside from the historians who contributed, the 1619 Project's authors are interested in history only in service to a political agenda, and I can assure you that my role as an historian is simply to understand what happened, and I don't have a political program I'm trying to advance. In 1773, Dr. Samuel Johnson asked rhetorically, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? And Johnson was neither the first nor the last to point out the moral hypocrisy of some of the American revolutionaries. Now, that same year of 1773, 4 men in Massachusetts, Peter Bestes, Felix Holbrook, Sambo Freeman, and Chester Joy, sent a petition to the Massachusetts General Court, which was engaged in a fervent struggle against Governor Thomas Hutchinson and the British ministry. Bestes, Freeman, Joy, and Holbrook took notice of the fact that the Assembly charged the governor and the British ministry for whom he worked with trying to enslave them, enslave the Assembly. The efforts made by the legislature of this province in their last sessions to free themselves from slavery, these 4 men wrote, gave us, who are in that deplorable state, a high degree of satisfaction. We expect great things from men who have made such a noble stand against the designs of their fellow men to enslave them. Here are 4 men who are actually enslaved, praising the Massachusetts Assembly for taking such a stand against their prospective enslavement. We cannot but wish and hope, sir, that you will have the same grand object, we mean civil and religious liberty, in view in your next session. The divine spirit of freedom, which seems to fire every human breast on this continent, except such as are bribed to assist in executing the execrable plan. The petitioners took the Assembly at their word in denouncing Parliament's aim at enslaving them, in arguing that slavery is an unnatural state. And if it was simply a rhetorical flourish, and if the Assembly, the patriot elite, simply meant freedom for us, this would have been their opportunity to set the record straight and inform the Massachusetts people who are currently enslaved, and 1 of every 14 Bostonians at the time was enslaved. That divine spirit of freedom was not meant to inflame their breasts, but only ours. But they don't. That summer, the commencement at Harvard included a forensic dispute conducted in Latin, and that year's topic was whether it is moral or legitimate for one person to enslave another. This is the argument we have as we introduce the idea of liberty in the 1760s and 1770s, as this divine spirit of freedom is firing every human breast on the continent. And still it makes us ask, could these people who are talking about the divine spirit of freedom believe it while they still owned other people? Could Jefferson, for example, have really meant in the Declaration that all men are created equal means all men are created equal? Now, Thomas Jefferson, whom my late and lamented friend Pauline Maier called the most overrated person in history, was sore in June of 1776 that he was in Philadelphia having to write the Declaration of Independence when he would have preferred being in Virginia writing that state's constitution. Instead, that work in Virginia fell to George Mason. And Mason's Virginia Constitution begins with a Declaration of Rights. Now remember, the Declaration says that in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That is, the purpose of government is to secure rights. And so it is natural that when you are creating a government, you explain what are the rights it is intended to secure. Now these are the same Virginians in 1776, who, according to the 1619 Project, the previous year had launched their revolution because the British were going to deny them their right to own enslaved people. The first article of the Virginia Constitution, as Mason drafted it, said that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights of which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Now, if this were empty, meaningless rhetoric, there would be no reason for the delegates to do anything but say amen and move on to the next clause. But they don't. They knew that 40% of the people in Virginia, in fact, had been divested of their liberty and the means to acquire and possess property. Now, if the Virginia delegates did not think that these men and women held in bondage were, in fact, men and women, and thus entitled to these fundamental rights, entitled to liberty, there would be no reason for this convention to make any changes. But after careful deliberation, they added a clause between all men having rights and not being able to divest their posterity. When they enter into a state of society, the amendment says, they create a legal fiction that the ancestors of these enslaved Virginians had at some point, before they had entered into a state of society, agreed to divest their descendants of these fundamental liberties. This lets the Virginians who own these people off of the moral hook. But it's curious why these men, whom the 1619 Project says had been motivated by a desire to keep their enslaved property, didn't forthrightly announce that that was their right, their prerogative. Instead, they insist that liberty is the birthright of all people. Now let's go back for a moment to Massachusetts, which drew up a state constitution in 1778. The voters in Massachusetts rejected it for a variety of reasons. One reason was the voters in some of the towns thought that their constitution should say something about slavery. They remembered the petitions of 1773. They remembered that fire of liberty burning in every human breast, and they knew about the service of their enslaved neighbors in the war which they were still fighting. So in 1780, a new convention drew up a constitution and once again submitted it to the voters. And like Virginia's constitution, this one begins with a Declaration of Rights. And its first article, written by John Adams, says, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. Some towns, notably Braintree and Rochester, objected. They thought this was too vague. They wanted a more emphatic denunciation of slavery. But the enslaved people in Massachusetts took notice of it, vague or not. Sometimes their former owners accommodated them as these people simply stopped being enslaved. Sometimes their owners would pay them wages, but in some cases they refused. And two of these cases, where the owners refused and in fact beat the people they considered their chattel, the cases wound up in court. Quock Walker in Worcester County and Elizabeth Freeman in Berkshire County brought their former owners to court. Walker's lawyer, Levi Lincoln, no relation to the future president, but later to be Attorney General of the United States in the Jefferson administration, argued that the Massachusetts Constitution's first article gave Quock Walker just as much right as his former owner, Nathaniel Jennison, to enjoy and defend his life and liberties, to acquire and possess property, and to seek and obtain happiness and safety. Now, if this were simply empty rhetoric, Walker and Lincoln would not have had much of a case. And if the men who had written and the people who had adopted the Massachusetts Constitution thought all men simply meant all white men, this would not have advanced to trial. But the judge presiding, William Cushing, who would later be appointed to the United States Supreme Court by President Washington, explained to the jury that sentiments more favorable to the natural rights of mankind have prevailed since the glorious struggle for our rights began. These sentiments led the framers of our Constitution to declare that all men are born free and equal, and that every subject is entitled to liberty. In short, Judge Cushing said, slavery is, in my judgment, as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence. The court are therefore fully of the opinion that perpetual servitude can no longer be tolerated by our government. This is the real meaning of the founding. Now, I'm not arguing here that our annuit septis should be 1783 when slavery ends in Massachusetts, or 1773 when the petitions are introduced, or some other date. But it's this period where we see Bestus, Freeman, Holbrook, and Joy arguing that the fire of liberty burns in every human breast on the continent, black and white, and that they are aspiring for civil and religious liberty that is the moment of change. The period saw the creation of some notable sets of rules to make these aspirations for civil and religious liberty into realities. Virginia's Declaration of Rights, the Massachusetts Constitution, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and, yes, the Constitution of the United States. We venerate these documents, those of us who do, because they secure to each of us the power to protect our liberties. We don't venerate them because they were created by demigods. Instead, we honor those imperfect men, Adams and Madison, Jefferson, Mason, and Washington, because they created this system which allows us to pursue our own imperfect truths. Thank you.